Welcome to the FinOps video series. My name is Everett Berry. I'm the head of growth at Vantage, and I'm here with Deana Solis, Senior FinOps Engineer at Smarsh. Welcome, Deana.
Thanks, I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. Let's start at the beginning. No one gets a degree in FinOps, at least not yet. How did you make your way into this role and into the practice of FinOps? And how has that evolved maybe from where you started to where you find yourself now?
So I think it's true that today no one gets a degree in FinOps, but and so one of the really common paths is to have varied backgrounds in both technology and in business or something more customer facing or product related. But in a very real way, the reason that I found my way to FinOps was that the first attempt at getting a college degree that I made failed.
Mm-hmm.
And I was fortunate to use that as a learning experience. I knew that I loved engineering, but I didn't have the tools to have the confidence that I could succeed. But it turns out that if that path had been easier for me, I wouldn't have spent the next 3 years learning about social sciences, organizational behavior, and using a lot of those tools with me to my next few roles and then eventually to IT.
Turns out organizational behavior is a huge aspect of FinOps, huh?
I think it's a huge aspect of why we do anything that that we're going to use to make our organizations better. FinOps, like its DevOps predecessor and like a lot of other things that we talk about in technology today, they sort of update the language, the vocabulary, and they update the tools to suit the paradigm, which in this case is the variable cost model of cloud consumption. It's a new set of tools, yes, but we still have to get back to how are organizations thinking about their processes and how well do those tools match. So we can't look at the tools without knowing how organizations are going to use them.
Right. One thing you've described to me is this difference between a centralized and a decentralized organization when it comes to the practice of FinOps. Some people also refer to it as embedded FinOps versus maybe centralized FinOps, I suppose is the term. What are the differences in those, and which have you seen maybe throughout your career?
I've seen both, and the difference is typically has more to do with how the company is organized or how the organization is prioritizing that feedback loop. Because at the end of the day, a lot of the data that we're dealing with, the billing data, is part of a really important feedback loop for engineers and people investing in those engineering resources to know what they have invested in, to know what value they've created. So sometimes that isn't happening throughout the company. So having a centralized FinOps team doesn't really make sense. If all of your cloud investment is only happening in this AI, ML, hush R&D group, or if it's only happening in the one area where you're ready to migrate your applications to the cloud, like it was in one of my previous experiences, it did make sense to invest heavily in that sort of training or skill sets. It made a lot more sense to hold the one team that was creating the spend accountable for knowing how they were going to invest in the future, knowing whether they were getting a return for their work to date, and that's the big difference between the two. And I think that it will continue to be that way because technology and cloud investment is is in companies whether or not they're developing their own software. And so it will continue to be a choose your own adventure.
Yeah. The thing that I think is sometimes challenging with that is usually there's a very small number of FinOps people, right? So
Sometimes one.
sometimes one. And so how does that person actually move through the organization to deal with the fact that maybe it is really one team that has all the spend, or maybe in fact the company has gone full cloud business office, which I'll ask you about in a minute. And therefore the FinOps person may have a morning meeting with one team and an afternoon meeting with a team involved in a whole other set of things.
So I think the question was, how do you do the context switching?
Right. Yeah. As the single FinOps person dealing with a variety of aspects of the business, in the maybe what you might call a decentralized model.
Yeah.
How do you structure and even achieve success with your work?
Well, I will say that there are limits. There are definitely limits, and there is a potential for burnout, and it leaves a lot of people who sort of gravitate toward hard problems to go down rabbit holes. That's not the answer you want, though.
It might be the most interesting answer, though.
Well, okay. I think there's a certain amount that individuals can mitigate, but there's also a certain amount that that organizations need to understand, and I'm talking about leaders, CTOs, CFOs. They need to understand that when they're empowering someone to do the job of leading cost optimization, they need to set that person up for success, and they need to set that person up with their sponsorship, that this is an important effort. We are your executive sponsors in this effort, and we're going to empower you and also supply you with resources to handle sort of the operational things of it, maybe buy a tool, subscribe to a tool that's going to to automate some of the toil of FinOps reporting and analysis a little bit easier. But it's also going to be setting up an environment where a person can succeed because collaboration is a shared value.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important, that the FinOps team or individual that you get is the one that you invest in. It's going to be the one that reflects the values of the company and the leadership.
Do you think it's incumbent on the FinOps practitioner to try to even suss that out in the interview stage or when they're considering a job, whether they're going to have the sponsorship that is required to really do this job?
Such a great question. Of course. So one of the things that I do in my communities, tech communities and affinity groups and things, is I'm a mentor, and I think that one of my most important messages is that your company hired you to complete certain objectives, to have certain outcomes, and you joined that company for a reason too. There's a relationship between the two of you, and they're responsible for making a good company, a good place to work, but you're also accountable for making that selection. Now, that said, we all have different degrees of power. Sometimes a startup will pay a little bit more because they know they can't hire as many resources, so they really want the one they invest in to be the person that they go all in on. I don't know if that's the greatest strategy.
Right.
Sometimes for the individual, though, they're thinking that they're joining this company because they need to learn, and they need to understand if their role is more junior or intermediate or senior management. They need to understand what the demands are going to be on them, as one does. But I think, in recent surveys and understanding now how the differences between candidates who apply for a job that they're 40 or 50% qualified for, and candidates who won't apply unless they meet 100% of the criteria.
Right.
Those are different kinds of people, and there's no right answer. Hopefully the gaps will be met by joining a company, figuring out what the actual investment is, and also working on your own tools, sharpening your own skills, and continuing to advance in learning the things that you find important. Like I don't do any sort of software programming,
Right.
But I love learning about the next most interesting programming language.
Mm-hmm.
For no good reason.
Rust.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. I don't know why, but I know Rust.
Yeah.
I know Go. I'm interested in knowing why those things are important, because at some point that's going to touch my ecosystem, and I want to be able to have some kind of empathy. I want to be able to share some sort of interest. All of those things are incumbent on, and that's how we develop our own careers. But other things will be more important. It might be more important that a company is local,
Right.
or that a company is global. I don't,
You do bring somewhat of a pretty hefty technical background, though, which is pretty relevant for cloud, which is capacity planning and data centers, actually. So would love to dive into that, because at the end of the day, that aspect and work stream actually is how AWS and others present discounts to customers, right? So talk to us about your background in data centers, and maybe if there's any aspects of that which help you understand just like what the heck is going on with a 3-year reserved instance.
Wow, you packed a lot.
It's a two-parter, really.
In the one question. So I do have a background in data centers, and I can go back to a data center being about the size of this room.
Wow.
I don't know, 14 by 12 or something, and a glass wall, and its own climate control. And that's what you needed to do for a data center, was you had to keep your equipment cool. Raised floors, something about flooding and wiring, and security. You had to have its own lock. Not everyone could get in. That level of physical separation. By the way, it's why hospitals usually locate it by the morgue, because the refrigeration units, you have to be close to that. And I did work in the basement of a hospital. And then we outsourced, and my first actual data center that I interacted with, where they called it a data center, was in Dearborn, Michigan. I never actually walked into that room, but I could visualize that there were racks that looked like a pantry with shelves, except instead of canned foods, there were blades, which were servers. And all I knew was it was a bunch of wires and a bunch of power systems and compute, memory, storage. And I absolutely was involved in guessing how much compute, memory, and storage an in-house effort might require. And usually we didn't get what we asked for.
Right.
Instead, what we got was sort of the hand-me-downs of systems that were being sunset or that sort of thing. And so I know what it's like to try to make the most of equipment that was already sunk costs. Maybe we bought it for a system that has been sunset, but now we've got the hardware and it can be reused, so we can install some other maybe SQL Server or some other shared resource, and keep squeezing something out of that old investment. I also, by the way, before that, sold computer hardware and software,
Oh, wow.
printers too, for small offices. And so for a company that was very focused on retail profit. And so I've always understood that the cost models around computing were either dangerously thin in gross margin, or a feast of unusable features, but that had great marketing behind them. I knew that relationship was always there, and so it made me very interested in how those things would grow, especially since our own inventory systems were growing, and I could see really big differences between what our retail point of sale system could do in terms of tracking inventory, 1 or 2 days lag, versus the standalone personal computers that had no internet connection because it was the 1900s. That sort of.
When you say 1900s, it does sound like a long time ago.
It was 1999. But because I had that experience, it wasn't really hard for me to make the connections with between computers themselves, servers, to data centers, and then to be able to make the connections and understand the cloud compute services, the offerings from the different providers, but then to also understand that how they were manipulating economies of scale, how they were squeezing the extra value out of their investment, and why it was a really risky proposition in the early days of cloud.
Right.
So I think the second part of that question.
Second part of the question is kind of what you were just talking about, which is there's the sense that really reserved instances, savings plans, and these upfront discounts are a means for the cloud providers to do capacity planning at huge scale. And these instruments try to work in some of the constraints of doing that. For example, maybe Amazon expects their server life to be 5 years. And so they give you a long-term time frame where you have to commit to an amount of spend or a particular type of instance. Do those factors come into play at all when you're thinking about discount strategy? And I guess the origin of the question is, does your background in requesting capacity in a physical data center help with that at all?
Oh, it is sort of polar opposites. The way that we were doing it then was largely on requirements that were handed to us by software providers who were, selling us a black box. Yeah. We had to accept whatever their requirements were. It has to be this speed processor with this storage capacity and this much temporary memory. We could accept those requirements, and then we could make some kind of estimation of how much we were going to use. And so planning for the capacity, if we're going to grow, this is how much data we're going to have to retain. Contractually, are there reasons why we would have to keep patient data online for so long? They were based largely on guesses, and we didn't have anything that looked like what we call observability right now. And I think observability is another area where we've always had monitoring, we've always known how much storage we bought, but we didn't have the observability to say which of our business processes, which of our value creating activities are actually consuming those resources, and which ones can we optimize on, and which ones can we organize around in order to make those things more sustainable. I think now what we have, we have the benefit of time as well. We have the benefit of learning. So I'd never go back to that sort of guessing.
Yeah.
But I also wouldn't ever go so far as to say that we have all the answers now. Because right now what we have with capacity planning is, I think we just have a disconnect between sort of staying within the lines, hitting targets versus investing in a way that's aligned with our goals.
Yeah.
It's natural to spend more money when you're growing and making more money. It's natural to do that to a point, and then when the returns start diminishing, it's natural to say, okay, I've got to optimize now and not invest anymore in that sort of processing power. We're not going to keep savings plans in perpetual renewal.
Yep.
For any reason. In fact, I think those are the reasons why you have to have strategies in place where you're normally, as an organization, with collaboration from different, different stakeholders, agreeing on, did the processes that we set up, are they still working? How well did we do? Is there something we're missing?
So you mentioned the word observability. Corey Quinn has a great tweet recently where he says, I'm paraphrasing here, but slap the word observability on something and you can charge 10 times more for it. What does observability mean to you? And in the context of FinOps and cloud, how does it apply?
I actually, I don't think you can slap a bill on it, because we've been talking about observability for so long. So what it means to me in the context of FinOps is that if you listen to some of the academic research around what elevates something to being observable, I think an easy way to think about it is, does it meet something that resembles scientific rigor? Something that looks like creating a hypothesis, having a question in mind that you're trying to answer, and having an understanding how to write a test to see if your hypothesis is null or not. And it's a simple thing that is part, or ought to be part, of software development anyway. Theoretically. But we know that it is also a thing that adds toil, and a thing that is definitely aided by automation. So I definitely think that observability can be aided by automation, but it cannot exist by itself without some understanding that you have to build it in. You have to be thinking about, when I'm writing this software, or when I'm not just writing software, when I'm writing my infrastructure as code, am I already thinking of ways that I can trace the events that happen when my infrastructure as code is acting as my hands on a keyboard?
Yep.
And if I am doing something manual and I mistype something and I hit the enter key, I get some kind of an error message immediately, or whatever I wanted to happen doesn't happen. And if I'm expecting that to happen through code for, so many more devices, I'm going to want to set that automation up to succeed the same way that I would set up an individual process.
Yeah.
That's a long way around to saying FinOps is, in a large way, a path to making cloud costs more observable, bring them into a feedback loop so that we can get the signals about the decisions we just made. We just changed the lifecycle management for a bunch of S3 buckets because we thought it would save us money. But now we're actually paying more.
Right.
Why is that? Do we understand the pricing model? Did we understand what we were testing, or did we just set up a very broad expectation that if you go left or right, it's going to be the correct answer? We have to be able to try something, experiment, and make that experiment observable. And I don't think that that's a new concept. I think that that's one of the basic things that you learn in science and engineering, is that you have to do testing. You have to be open to a guess that you made being wrong. In fact, that if you get the feedback that you were wrong about your hypothesis in the first place, you can move faster to the next thing. Okay, I don't have to spend any more time on that hypothesis anymore because it was wrong. Mm-hmm. And the observability, the data that I got back from the tools that I set up, the instrumentation that I put the time in, then it will lead me to higher value activities. But that's a really broad way to think about it. And I don't think most engineers are necessarily thinking, I want to be working on the highest value thing. Yeah. And so what we have to do is we have to create good habits. We have to create a good sense that we don't cut these corners because we value our own autonomy. And so we want to make sure that we're upholding our end of that trust.
And as a FinOps industry or space, we're not super close to that observability golden standard, would you say? I mean, even from pressing enter on a keyboard and getting feedback, a lot of the bills don't come in till 2 days later.
I think one of the first things we were observing was really just making sure that our cloud providers billed what they said they were going to and not more. And they weren't making mistakes on their bill. And it's an important function. I can dismiss it a little bit with humor, but it is a really important function because it's such a complex bill.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of automation involved, and the only way they're going to know that they got something wrong is if their customers notice, I didn't consume that much, why am I being billed in that way? And so in one sense, it was born out of a sort of watchdog effort. But it's such a limited, it's such an incomplete use of the talent of people who can understand this language. Because I mean, cloud service providers, they come in with their own vocabulary, dictionaries of vocabulary for us. And so, yeah, to be able to swim in that, no, we aren't where we need to be. But I think that with more collaboration across cloud providers, across cloud vendors, and all of us sort of talking to each other and the consumers, we're able to kind of move the conversation forward so that we're not making the same old mistakes, and now we're solving new and more important problems. And we're also just seeing how we can sort of learn from each other's journeys and not keep moving backwards. It won't be perfect, but I mean, I think that having a community of FinOps practitioners is one of the largest values, or one of the biggest assets that we as practitioners need to sort of exploit. We need to lean on each other so that, because so often there's only one or two of us
Right.
Isolated in a company. If we're not reaching out into the open source community, into whatever our industry meetups are, then we're missing a lot of opportunity to collaborate.
Yeah, and one of the biggest efforts happening right now on that front is focus. And maybe for the folks at home, if you can explain what focus is,
Oh boy.
and the sort of open source collaborative effort within the FinOps community to make focus a thing and ultimately have it implemented by these different providers.
Yeah, and because I'm not actually involved in the project, I'm very much a casual observer.
Right.
Much smarter people advising on the direction of that. But people coming from every industry, from different cloud providers, to get a vendor agnostic standard of specifications. We're all sort of measuring the same things. Not all of them. I mean, some people are measuring their carbon footprint in a way that is new and relevant for them in ways that other people, they're just not there yet. They've just not got the resources to where they can start thinking about that, because it's cognitive matter and you only have so much. But having some of that handled, it's not going to happen without pressure from consumers, pressure from people in the community who have shared values. And I do think actually that it's one of the most exciting things that's happening in open source today, because it's not only software developers talking about it. It's business leaders who are committing resources to it. And
I've sometimes heard focus described as just agreeing what the column names should be, but it really goes much beyond that.
I think it's to be seen. I'm very optimistic about it, only because I have a lot of respect for the people who are heading the effort.
Yeah.
I've just seen some incredibly intelligent and passionate people about no one particular product, but just leaving this whole space a little bit better than we found it.
Yep.
For everybody.
Yep. Deana, thank you so much for being here on the FinOps video series.
It's a pleasure being here.
My name is Everett, and if you'd like to learn more about FinOps or learn more about Vantage, you can visit our website at vantage.sh.